Hi. So some time ago a discussion came up on the Scholar Forum regarding sword throwing, and the question was, why would you throw your sword away? Well, the first thing to say is you have to think of the sword as a tool. Okay, it's not a magical object, and in a medieval context, which is what we're talking about here, it's very rarely your only weapon. Okay, even in a civilian context, if for some reason you were a civilian carrying a sword around, which actually wasn't as common as most people think, because it was illegal to carry swords in most European cities, not so much in Germany and Italy, but I'll talk about that in another video. But if you were a civilian, you would almost certainly have a knife or a dagger as well. And remember, wrestling and unarmed fighting is essentially another tool in your armoury. So if you throw your sword away, it's not like you're completely helpless. There are lots of other things you can do. Okay? On the battlefield, as I've mentioned in a previous video, the sword is a secondary or sometimes tertiary weapon. So usually if you were a knight, for example, your primary weapon would be a lance on horseback or on foot, a spear or a poleaxe. If you were a lower down class, sort of middle class soldier, your primary weapon would probably be a pike, a halberd, a spear, perhaps a large shield with a polearm of some kind. These kind of weapons, okay? These are battle fighting weapons. Swords are personal defence, essentially backup weapons, okay? They're the things you walk around with on your belt. So when you throw your sword away, the first thing to say is you've usually got something else in your arsenal that you can use against the opponent, and that's usually immediately what you would follow up with upon throwing your sword. Now the second thing to say is we know that they definitely did throw swords. It is explicitly shown in, for example, the Gladiatoria Codex, which shows a judicial duel, a trial by combat situation, where they start off with a set of weapons, for example, a small shield, a spear, a longsword and a dagger, and one of the people throws the spear, maybe throws the sword, then closes in with the dagger, wrestling, so on, and they're in armour. However, it's also shown unarmoured in Fiore de Liberi's treatise, Fior di Battaglia, and this position for throwing the sword is shown with the two fingers behind the cross, like that. And although Fiore actually doesn't physically show the throwing, he talks about throwing weapons a lot, and he talks about how to defend from them. In other words, beating them aside and then closing in to hit the person as quickly as possible. So we know that throwing of weapons was done. So why might you throw your weapon? Well, we've already mentioned the judicial duel situation, where essentially you enter the ring with a whole bunch of weapons and you can't use them all at once, and you can't fight very well carrying them. So as you close in distance, you very well may chuck one of your weapons at the opponent as you close in to actually fight them. And you know, where's it going to go? It's going to hit them, and it will either wound them or it won't wound them, and it will end up on the floor probably. So it's still there, you can still get to it, it's not disappeared. But in a sort of self-defense or street fighting or skirmish or battle situation, why might you want to throw a sword? Well, quite simply, if you read original accounts of combat, very often you want to attack someone who you can't quite get to in time, or maybe you can't reach. Maybe they're the other side of a wall, or the other side of a fence. Maybe they're inside a building, fighting out of a window. Maybe they're just about to kill your companion over there, and you can't quite get to them in time. So there's all sorts of situations why you might want to throw a sword. Okay? It's just another useful skill to have in your skill set of things you can do with this weapon. And the last thing I want to say is it effective? Well, I actually did some tests. I got a log, and I've got this video. I've actually got it on YouTube, but I've set it to not be visible at the moment. I might change that with time. Where we threw various things, including a longsword, not this one, but a cheap one, at the log. And essentially, it was incredibly effective, up to about, for me, for about 10 feet. Okay, 10, 12 feet, something like that. And this is an interesting distance, because it's obviously not the distance at which you're going to shoot someone from with a bow or a crossbow, but it's a distance whereby you can't comfortably reach them very quickly. So it's like the second or third rank of the enemy, or someone, like I mentioned, in a poking their head through a window of a building during a siege or something. So it's an interesting distance to be able to throw things at. It's also the same kind of distance you tend to throw axes and knives at. And essentially it's not that difficult. If you know how to throw a spear or a javelin, throwing a longsword is pretty much the same. Because the longsword's a fairly balanced object, because you've got the pommel at the back, it flies surprisingly well, and the trick seems to be to throw it so it spins as it flies. This helps it go straighter. And in terms of its effectiveness on the target, it penetrated incredibly deeply, so much that I had to put my foot against the log and waggle the sword repeatedly to get it out. It was incredibly deep penetrating. And my estimation on lots of test cutting experience is that if you threw that at a person's body, if they were unarmoured, probably it would go all the way up to the hilt and all of the blade would be sticking out their back. So I think it's an incredibly powerful thrown object because it's relatively heavy and incredibly sharp and very little resistance going in. So yes, it's an effective thrown object. It was done historically, and there are lots of situations you can think of where it might be useful to know how to do that. So get a cheap longsword and give it a try because it's good fun. Cheers.